Today, we're continuing our conversation about all things origins. Is the earth old? Is it young? Did God use theistic evolution? What about intelligent design? We've been discussing all of those topics and the theological implications on this podcast. And today we're going to zero in on a literal atom. I've shared in the past my view that I don't really have a dog in the fight as far as exactly how old the earth is, but the hill that I will die on is maintaining the theological and historical view that Adam is a literal person. And I read the book of Genesis as actual history. And so we're going to talk through today with a special guest, Dr. J.R. Miller, who has thought very deeply about all of these topics, about what we're really talking about when we say Adam was a literal person. Was he the sole progenitor of the human race, the sole biological progenitor of the human race? And what do we mean when we say we read Genesis literally? What do we mean by the words that we're using? And then what are the theological implications of Adam being not a historical person, of him just being a representative or some sort of a mythological character? We're going to talk through some of the views of William Lane Craig and his mytho-history and where Dr. Miller disagrees with Dr. Craig. But I do want to say this. Please understand that this is an issue that I believe faithful Christians can agree to disagree about. I do think it's incredibly problematic for a Christian to hold the view of theistic evolution, but I'm not going to divide with somebody as a Christian if they believe that. And I'm certainly very grateful for a lot of the work that Dr. William Lane Craig has done, especially through my faith crisis. I watched a ton of his content and read, I think maybe one of his books that was really particularly helpful to me. And I've even had him on the podcast to talk through atonement. He is fabulous on the atonement. So I'm going to encourage you to go back and listen to that in the archives. So even though there's going to be some disagreement today, does not mean that I'm not very grateful for a lot of the work that William Lane Craig has done. But this is an issue where I do have some concerns about some of the views that have been popping up and then the theological impact of those views. So we're going to talk through all of that with Dr. Miller. Well, do want to let you know that he has a study guide out on Genesis, and this just looks so amazing. So he kind of takes the reader through the very simple questions of, what is Genesis? What kind of a book is it? How are we supposed to approach it? What does it mean when we say that God created the universe out of nothing? And talking what Genesis might speak to science. And he kind of covers all of those questions. So it's called Set Apart: The Uniqueness of Hebrew Cosmology. And you can find that on morethancake.org, which is his website. But right before we get to this conversation, I want to let you know that today's episode is brought to you by Brave Books, a Christian children's entertainment company. And you can get 20% off by going to bravebooks.com/childers and use the code childers. Well, Joe, let's start by talking about what kind of a book Genesis is, because there has been a lot of discussion about that. And then in the context of this podcast, we've been having discussions about theistic evolution, a literal Adam, intelligent design, young earth, old earth, all of those questions that really surround this book of Genesis. So we're going to go theological today. We're going to cover some scientific points as they would relate to theology, but ultimately, I want to start with just this book of Genesis. Now, I do want to say before I throw this over to you that if anyone is curious about what we're talking about when we talk about maybe mytho-history, there's a lot of conversation about that right now with William Lane Craig's view. And I want to let anybody listening know that I did a whole episode with Joe on that specific topic. You can look that up back in the archives. Joe, of course, you read William Lane Craig's book. You didn't really, you had some issues with some of the way he's approaching Genesis, and it can be confusing. In fact, maybe I'll just start here. So I posted a little clip a few weeks ago of Johnny Artavanis, who's a pastor here in Nashville area, saying something like Genesis is not mytho-history, as some apologists like to call it. And I loved the quote from him that he said that. But then my comment section was flooded with people saying, William Lane Craig is not saying that it's a myth. Mytho-history doesn't mean myth. So maybe before we get into how to think about Genesis as a book, give us just a quick thumbnail sketch of what we're talking about when we talk about William Lane Craig's view of mytho-history.
Yeah, well, it's always great to be back with you first, got to say that. And I have been tracking with some of your conversations on these origins with your scholars and writers that you bring in. And it's been really interesting to watch and see where people are going with this. So yeah, Craig's view, uh, mytho-history is what he'll argue is that the Bible, that Genesis specifically 1 through 11, is a specific genre or literary style that incorporates both mythic elements and historical elements. So that's all he's doing by that. Yes, he's not going to argue it's anti-history, but he will argue that it's prehistory, and so it has parts of it that are clearly, in his view, unbelievable, or just simply nobody would have believed that they were true. They were just used to illustrate some important point that had to come across in an ancient culture. That's his basic idea. And it does get complicated. I have a whole series, a couple parts that I've been doing on this. And honestly, I think there's some strategic ambiguity in his language
Mm.
that's intentionally there, because it's sort of like that. Oh, is what a lot of people do is they make an argument and they can always fall back to something else. And I don't think Craig's in that intentionally. I just think there's some ambiguity in the language that can always be traded on. Well, you don't understand, or you don't fully get this. So if people get overwhelmed by it, you're not alone.
Okay. All right. Well, I want to talk about Genesis because what it always boils down to for Christians, I think, is do we take the creation story in Genesis literally? And that's a kind of a
Mhm.
loaded question because I think everybody would agree there is elements of some poetic language. I mean, for example, when you have God walking in the garden with Adam and Eve, obviously we know God doesn't have a body. He doesn't have physical arms and legs. So that is some type of analogous language or poetic language. So there's definitely some elements of that in there. But when I say that I take the creation story of Genesis literally, I mean that it literally happened the way God said it happened. And so obviously
Mhm.
we can extrapolate from there, but how should we interpret the opening chapters of Genesis? Like, I know you've come up with something you're calling theo-history, which is maybe,
Yeah.
up over and against William Lane Craig's
Yeah.
mytho-history, but talk about, is it history? Is it poetry? Is it allegory? How should Christians approach this?
Yeah. I think this is what's really important. And I did use that language, come up with that language of theohistory to be intentional, to create an intentional contrast. But I look at theohistory not as I'm not claiming that's a genre of literature like poetry or legal studies like we would get in some of the books of Moses, where you're giving, history of the legal cases and the law. What I'm suggesting is that theohistory is a hermeneutical approach. It's a way of reading the text that I think offers a consistency across those things. So uh, it's how we interpret the genre. It gives us a framework for interpreting that genre. So theohistory, in my view, shapes how we read all of those genres, whether it be poetry or not. And we can argue about Genesis, is there poetry? I'm actually fine even if part of Genesis 1 and 2 are poetic. I don't think they have the markers of Hebrew poetry. But even if one concludes that, it doesn't change the substance of it. And this is what happens when certain people use genre. That what they mean is, well, if that's poetry, then it somehow changes the historical value of the content. Let me give you an example of what I mean. If I took the poem, we all know, "'Twas the Night Before Christmas." That's Clement Clark Moore from 1823. It's this whole, "It was the night before Christmas, when all through the house," that whole thing. There's Santa and there's reindeer. Obviously, there's poetic verse there, and it's not to be taken as literal historical events. It's describing that. Well, in 2007, when my now youngest child was born, we had this wild adventure with my wife, and she went into labor, and she didn't want to tell us all, and it was like this urgent thing getting to the hospital in time because she wanted to wait, and because she'd had a couple long labors before. And so I ended up writing this poem. "'Twas the Night Before Baby," and I used that verse and that rhyme, and it tells us driving through the back roads, and I'm getting directions from my tom tom, which goes back in the day. If people don't know what those are, look them up. They're historical technology before the modern ways of driving around. But anyway, so I have this whole thing, but all of the details in my poem are true events. They're true historical things. And so theohistory says we don't, even if we know the genre type, and this is, I think, what Craig does is a little bit misleading. He thinks by identifying a unique genre through 1 through 11 that this tells us something about the substance of what's being discussed. And I think that asks too much of our genre. And so I think that's the first thing. And then the second thing is, when we look at theohistory, it's going to shape how we count time. And this gets into the older, the younger stuff that I think is really critical. So I argue that I think Genesis is agnostic about Earth's age.
Yeah.
It's not that there isn't a real historical Earth age. It's something we know, but Genesis just isn't concerned with that because that's not what the Hebrew worldview was really cared about. It cares about material origins, that God spoke and everything came into existence. And that's a real historical event in space-time reality. But it's not about counting out the age. And that's true about humanity as well, then, when we look at especially the genealogies. And this is the last point on this that I think we'll make. And if you have some questions on this, but I'm trying to get to the most controversial ideas here and why it matters. When we look at the genealogies, Old Testament or New Testament, there's actually consistency there. Not the Genesis table of nations isn't a unique genealogy set distinct from even Luke and Matthew that we get in the New Testament. They're certainly framed by an ancient worldview of how they accounted time and the importance of it. But it's not about counting back the age of when humanity began on the earth. It's about God's salvation plan. That's what it's calculating. It's showing that God has a plan that's consistency. So you'll get a listing of, say, for example, people groups. This shows the theological purposes, shares both our sacred origin as image bearers, but also our sin origin in the fall. And historically, it's going to trace things like we see different purposes like family, lineage, legal, political, or ethnic origins. It traces judgment or blessing. It also traces like religious obligations. So the tribe of Levi, who had temple obligations, you find these genealogies of musicians in there. Why? Because it was showing that they had a historical purpose for functioning in this role. So they'll have what's called telescoping. They'll have gaps in those ancestral lines, sometimes just for symmetry, like numbers of 10 or 14. And that's not anti-history. It's not ahistorical. They're real people, real places, real times, but it's gaps. So if I was telling you my history and I said, going back to my great-great-great-great-grandfather, and he did this great thing, I could skip 3 generations and then I could go to my great-grandfather. But it doesn't mean there weren't people in the intervening years. It's just I'm telling a story for a purpose, for a specific goal in mind. So I'll leave out details because it doesn't change the purpose of that story at that time. And that's what God's doing there. So there's different things we can look at. Like definition of son means something different. The meaning of father in Hebrew worldview thinking and the way the language does. And so when we interpret that wrongly from our cultural perspective, we don't take into account how that language is used, and it doesn't always prove what we think it proves.
Yeah, that's helpful because as I've thought through this question, so a little backstory on because I've actually given this question quite a bit of thought because when I was in crisis of faith, 10, 15 years ago, the people who were really helping answer a lot of the questions, the skeptical questions that I was dealing with, were people that I learned fairly early on were old earth creationists. And that completely freaked me out. I was following Norm Geisler and Frank Turek and some of these others, and I'm going, okay, wait, what? Because I think I just sort of caught the idea that the only biblical view is that the earth is young. And so this caused like a second crisis where I'm like, wait a second, am I following the wrong people? So I just had to like go to the Bible and look at the Bible and say, okay, what is the Bible actually teaching? And the more I looked at it, and I think Norm Geisler, I'll link this article, but he has a really important article that helped me a lot. And it says, does believing in inerrancy require one to believe in young earth creationism? And in that article, he pointed out some of the things that you just said, that when they were giving genealogies, that there was expected to be some gaps. It's not like the Bible was giving these genealogies so that you could count the years and say precisely this is how old the earth is. So when I realized the Bible isn't actually speaking to the question of years, of exactly how old the earth is, but but for me, the hill that I would die on is the Adam and Eve hill. And so back when I was first investigating this question, it made sense to me biblically to say, well, look, the the literal Adam matters because the gospel, Romans, talking about through one man, sin entered the world and death spread to all men because all sinned. So you have this entry of sin and death through this man Adam. Well, that would have to be a real person
Mhm.
for that the gospel really to make sense. So that was where I was comfortable for a while, but then I started to see like the William Lane Craig view and even more overtly the theistic evolution view that would say, well, Adam, wasn't necessarily a literal person, but then they're saying, well, he was. Like he's a literal person, but just one of many. So we're going to discuss all of that today because there's
Yeah.
a lot in there. But let's just
Mhm.
talk about maybe scripture. Like how is Adam presented throughout scripture? Because as I was investigating this question, I don't think there's room in scripture to say that Adam was just sort of some kind of mythical person or you go back so far in history and it was just sort of this idea of all people, Adam meaning all people. There's something more specific to it. So can you speak to that question? I'm so glad I get to partner with Brave Books, which is a Christian children's entertainment company that has a streaming platform called Brave Plus, where you can give your kids carefully curated shows and stories that avoid overstimulation. I know so many parents are worried about that right now because it seems like so much of the video content that is aimed at our kids is just kind of catering to that very short attention span. Well, Brave Books is fighting against that. So their content is going to avoid that overstimulation, encourage positive behavior, and reinforce biblical truth. They have partnered with friends like Kirk Cameron, Frank Turek, Melissa Doherty to put out shows and books that are really going to shape the hearts and minds of the next generation. We give Brave Books to our grandkids and all the kids in our life, and I just love what they're doing. So right now, you can get 20% off your first purchase by going to bravebooks.com/childers and using the code Childers. Again, go to bravebooks.com/childers, use the code Childers.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is where I would say the theohistory part would emphasize the historical side of Adam. And so just a quick survey of those key passages, Genesis 1:27, chapter 2 and 7 talks about Adam and Eve made as image bearers of God, both formed and filled, is this divine act of intimacy and love. They're born in love, not violence. And when you look at ancient Near East mythologies of human origins, you find these ideas that humanity is born as slaves to the gods, to do the work that was beneath the gods. There's one, the Akkadian epic of Enuma Elish is really one of those examples that always gets pulled out in these things. But there's a story of humanity where the greater gods are over the lesser gods, and the lesser gods rebel because they don't want to do the slave labor of the greater gods. And so the greater gods come down, kill one of these lesser gods called the Igigi, and their blood mixes with the earth, which is already made out of violence, where Marduk kills Tiamat and uses her body to shape the earth and the heavens. But the blood of this lesser god blends with the earth, and out of it comes humanity, and now they become the slave labor of the other gods. So human nature, there's no sacred value to it. They're just doing the work that's beneath the higher gods. And so there becomes not only a hierarchy of gods, but a hierarchy of humanity. Well, in Genesis, obviously, that's really significant because we see God as an artisan, as a craftsman, who's in Genesis 1:1 says everything was tohu and bohu, was formless and empty. And then then he forms and then he fills. And that exact same pattern, I argue, gets repeated in Genesis chapter 2, where God forms Adam out of the dust of the ground, and then he fills him by breathing in this breath of life. And that pattern of the artisan craftsman God is really critical to show that all humanity has sacred value, and our origin is different. But then Genesis 3 obviously talks about the rebellion of Adam and Eve against the wisdom and the love of God. And so this is going to tell a real beginning of how God's good and very good creation begins to be corrupted. Genesis 5 then gives this genealogy, this is where genealogy starts to come in. It's a genealogy of Adam down through Abraham to show a direct line of both sacredness and sin. And this is I think it's a hermeneutical point here. It's an interpretive point. And this is where some theistic evolutionists misunderstand, I believe, the purpose of like Table of Nations and the purpose of these genealogies. And again, as I said before, it shows ethnic origins and legal origins and ancestral lines. But it's also showing that even though God is going to select the line of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to be the instrument of his covenant plan of salvation, all other ethnicities, all other people groups still share in the sacredness of God's image, and they still share in sin. That's why in Genesis 12, all nations will be blessed. And this is where, like Craig's or mytho-history, I think, break down, because he wants to argue Genesis 1 through 11 based on his understanding of even genealogies and why they were written. He cuts it off at 11, but Genesis chapter 12 is really the continuation of that, of 1 through 11. You can't, 1 through 11 make no sense without 12, which is the call of Abraham. That's the actual pinnacle of God's solution that we read, and where it begins with Adam, traces through all humanity, is impacted, but now God has a specific plan. And then we see in Luke 3, Matthew and Jude as well, Adam is the son of God, literally says the son of God. This is that trading on meaning of what the word son in the Hebrew means. So he's the son of God, who is the son of God. And then his son goes through Abraham and then down, all the way down to Jesus. And Jesus then becomes the bridge through his virgin birth from the history of theohistory to the theology of history. Because now Jesus, through the virgin birth, fulfills prophecy, and he's the Son of God, Son of Man, truly God, truly man. To be the Son of Man is the son of Adam. To be the Son of God is this eternal Son of God. So without that historical, there is no theological. And I think that pattern is very clear and critical throughout the New Testament into the Old Testament into the New Testament.
So I used to say, the hill I would die on is Adam is a literal person, but then I have found that I need to refine my language a little bit more, because more and more people that lean into more of the theistic evolution perspective are saying, oh no, we believe in a literal Adam and Eve as real people also, but they mean something kind of different. So can you explain the differences, and maybe
Yeah.
what is the language we should use? Because I know what I mean. I mean like a special creation, not evolved from a previous form of primate, like the one and only, So what's the language that we should use? And maybe explain the difference, so that when people say that, it can sound good. You can be like, oh, okay, well, we're on the same page, but we're really not, because we're kind of talking about different things here.
Yeah, you've pointed out a really critical piece here, because when we say the words literal or historical, academics love to nuance all of that language to use the same word, but they're really trading in different definitions of it. And so a lot of people can become persuaded by certain arguments because they're just using the same word. So I'll just pick on Craig's just for a minute. So when Craig says that he believes, and he's theologically committed to a historical Adam, he says in his work that without a historical Adam, there cannot be a historical Jesus, and he says that's true. The difference is with his mytho-history, he's saying Adam is a historical figure, but the Bible doesn't really teach us anything about the historical Adam. It only teaches about the theological Adam. So he says he's historical, but we have no access to the historical Adam. And so he'll make arguments along the lines of, well, even if Paul treats him as a historical figure, or even if Jesus treats him as a historical figure, we're not obligated to follow what Paul believed or even what Jesus believed. It's what the Bible intends to teach us that matters. So Paul could have really believed that he was historical, and Genesis tells us who that historical person is. We're just not obligated to Paul's beliefs about that, only what the intent of what Paul is teaching, the theological purpose of it. Well, the problem I have with all those things, and other people have different framings of those, and we can look at each of those different models too. I'm happy to unpack that in just a little bit as well. But the problem with all of those is it leaves the Christian, the reader of the Bible from the last 2,000 years, without access to historical reality or truthfulness, because only through modern experts of, scientific experts, or through academic people who have studied this for years, can we then know the difference between theology and mythology, what's historical and what's not. And so then we're left at the mercy of these experts to tell us, well, this is what counts and this is what doesn't. I don't think the Bible was intended to be read that way. So I think there's a danger in what this does in alienating the reader, the Christian, from the actual text. So we don't know which parts are trustworthy historically and which are not. So when I say Adam's a real historical man in space and time, I, like you, would define that as saying he's the sole biological progenitor of all humans who have ever existed. Eve is truly the mother of every human who has ever existed. And I think that's a historical and a theological claim. And
So that
that gets played out throughout scripture. Yeah.
yeah, that's good, because Trisha was saying it that way as well, because I was saying
Hmm.
real historical person or literal person, and she added to that sole progenitor of the human
Yeah.
race. So by using the language of sole progenitor, we're sort of eliminating the idea that Adam and Eve were just two of a broader population of like 10,000 or something like that. But we're saying
Yeah.
the one and only Adam and Eve are, not
Yeah.
a part of a larger population. And why would that be a theological problem? If Adam
Yeah.
and Eve simply, let's say there was this group of 10,000 or so of that particular hominid, and God breathed his life, or whatever that would mean poetically, and maybe stamped Adam and Eve with his image. Theologically, why would that be a problem
Hmm.
versus them being the sole
Yeah.
progenitors?
So I would add that word biological, a sole
Okay.
biological progenitor
Sole
actually in there,
biological. Okay.
because, and this gets into some inside baseball, and you can tell me how deep you want to go here, but Craig will affirm that Adam is the sole progenitor. And there's a whole issue with that when Fuzz Rana of Reasons to Believe said that his view undermines Adam as sole progenitor. And Craig says, well, he read it, he didn't read his work, and he's sloppy thinking. But there is a trade of language here that gets very technical between genealogical ancestry, which is a claim that Josh Schwamanias makes about using population genetics, essentially. So where you could have Adam and Eve as the sole theological fountainhead of humanity, but there could have been other humans outside of that population group who were biological contributors to the line of human ancestry. So it just opens this door to, were they really the first two humans, one or the other? So by adding that word biological, it forces us to say, let's be very precise here. Were they really the first two human beings to ever exist? And did every human who ever existed descend from that couple? And theologically, of course, again, it goes back to the table of nations, Genesis 10 and 12. If they're not, if there are other sources, if there's a population of hominids, pre-humans, that existed and they evolved to become humans, were Adam and Eve the only two? There's historical views of ancestry that said, well, every different racial group had their own Adam and Eve. So there was a white Adam and Eve, and there was a black Adam and Eve, and there was an Asian Adam and Eve. So these ideas go back, and they have huge theological ramifications for the value of other human beings. And of course, in Romans, if sin comes into the world through one man and death through sin, and then Corinthians talks about if that one man, if it's fair that death comes to all through that one man, it's only fair that righteousness, holiness, salvation comes through that one man, Jesus. So there seems to be a clear one-to-one correlation there. But if sin is just Adam and Eve were the first to recognize that they had some moral culpability, but everybody was doing it, but what made them human was some psychological awareness of their flaws, well, then that's not the origin of sin, truly. It's just the origin of the recognition of sin. Some
Mm.
people trade in. So that, again, speaks to who was Jesus. Really, what is he doing? Is he just covering over our psychological awareness of guilt, or is he actually truly accounting for the sin of humanity and its origins? So, and then of course there's other theological things. If God made Adam first, then Eve, and if that's a true thing, which I actually believe is true, I think God literally formed Adam out of the dust of the ground and breathed into him this breath of life. Yes,
Yeah.
it's anthropomorphic language in a sense, but we know that God walked with him and Jesus walked in there. So I don't have no problem with a physical God in some way presenting himself, even though he's spiritual, to this creation and doing something. But that has a theological implication for the purpose of male and the purpose of female and marriage and all of those things that are critical to the historical Adam and Eve as sole biological progenitors of all humanity.
Are you looking for a summer experience for your student aged 13 to 22? Well, I want to tell you about Summit Ministries that has these summer camp like experiences in Colorado and in South Carolina. I'm on the faculty there, so every summer I get to go and teach the students about things like deconstruction, historic Christianity, and progressive Christianity. Summit Ministries has been doing these camps and these experiences for over 60 years, and this is just great training for students ages 13 to 22. They don't shy away from the difficult topics. They talk about abortion, gender identity, how we know we can trust the Bible, even questions like, if God is good, why is there evil? This is going to just give your kids such a helpful support in their biblical worldview. So go to summit.org/Alisa26 and lock in the early bird rate, which is going to be $250 off, but that ends on March 31st. So make sure you get that early bird. But if you also use my code Alisa26, you're going to get another $250 off for a total of $500 off. So definitely go today. Don't waste any more time. Get to summit.org/Alisa26. Use that code Alisa26 for up to $500 off. Again, summit.org/Alisa26, code Alisa26. Okay, so I don't even know if I should ask this question. I'm afraid it's a stupid question, but I'm going to ask it anyway because you've studied this a lot more than obviously than I have. But the issue that I have too is when you think about for me, it comes down to the impact it has on the idea of original sin or humans having this fallen nature,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because if you don't have a literal Adam, you don't have the fall
Yeah.
really in some kind of a state of being. And so if and maybe I'm not characterizing this view correctly, so you can correct this as well. But on the view that, let's
Mm-hmm.
say, Adam and Eve were one of 10,000 other, pre-people, and God chose the two of them to stamp with his image, to give some sort of, moral consciousness or something. And then they fall, then it would seem to be that only their line would have the fall. But if there's
Yes.
10,000 other people, then their kids are inevitably going to be procreating, most likely, with other people of that 10,000 population. So then
Yeah.
what are the issues then that come in on that view, how do they answer these things?
Yeah.
Because then you would have potentially a whole line of people that only are like half fallen or a third, a fourth fallen with the further down you get and the more
Yep.
interbreeding that happens. So that's a huge issue and a huge problem for me when we're thinking about the gospel really being built upon this idea, first of all, that humans are made in the image of God and that image is distorted by sin, and that
Mm-hmm.
each and however they work it out on the east or the west side of the church, that humans are inherently broken. We're fallen. We have this sin nature. And that gets very muddied for me when you start talking about there being 10,000 other people in that population.
Yeah. So one, that's not a dumb question. That I think is the $1,000,000 question. I think it's the brilliant question that we're not supposed to ask for some people, because what will happen is those that embrace some form of theistic evolution, which is God directing this process of animal to human biological adaptation, right? Specifically, that form of evolution, animal to human evolution, they'll just say, well, I affirm this. Well, I think that's true. But the problem isn't whether they affirm it or not. I believe that if they say they affirm it, they affirm it. The problem is, does your hermeneutic of reading the text and does your theology of human origins actually allow for that belief to persist? So a lot of people just try to dismiss that by saying, well, nobody denies that. Well, that's not, again, that's not the issue. It's the question is, does their view of human origins undermine that theology? And I argue that it does to varying degrees, depending on their view. So even though individuals advocate for those things, you start to see those things fall. So Craig, for example, will argue in his view, well, his view is compatible with this concept of original sin, but he doesn't believe in original sin. He believes in the fall, but not original sin in that way. And partly he's probably just predisposed to that theologically, but internal coherence of his view, it makes sense to him given his version of theistic evolution. He doesn't need that to happen. So I think it's important to understand historically then what would happen is Christians in the first centuries would have pretty much universal agreement that Adam was a historical person who brought sin into the world and that Jesus was the second Adam. Where they theologically diverged was about how to interpret those historical realities. How much was analogy, like we talked about earlier? How much did Adam have to be historical? And in what way to support the New Testament teaching that was agreed upon? And this is kind of where we're still divided in that theological sense. But we do it under the guise of, bringing in science, or at least the consensus science. So if you want, I could give you the four models that I think are dominant
Yeah.
right now and explain those
Let's do that. That
and
would be
where they
helpful.
deal
Yeah.
with that problem. Okay. So, and before I do that, one last thing too, I want to make a point out why I think your question is brilliant. This is something I'm in the middle of exploring, but I haven't really nailed down because it's so like, oh, my head hurts when I say this.
Mm.
What does it mean to be a soul, an ensouled body? The soulish transmission of this. How does theistic evolution impact our theology of the soul? And I'm in the middle of trying to unpack Craig's view of that. And he has some odd ideas that, in terms of what we could evolve to become, some soulish things. But trying to collect it and codify it is really challenging. So when you ask that question, what are the theological implications? I'm like, oh my goodness. I think there are many. Just the question of can we unpack it all? So
right.
This is something to keep in the background. I think people need to spend more time on.
Okay.
So here's the models.
Real quick, before we go to the models,
Yeah,
let's just tie up one little loose end here for me. And that is you
absolutely.
brought up the idea of throughout church history, the way that Christians have viewed a literal or however, soul biological progenitor. I'm going to practice saying that now.
Yeah.
Soul biological progenitor of the human race, Adam and Eve as real people. And I've heard a lot of people argue, well, early church history, they didn't really view it as literal. They saw it more as allegory. And they'll even cite people like Augustine. Now, I'm no Augustine expert, but I've read enough of Augustine to see that, he's got an allegorical interpretation of Genesis, but there are other places where he talks about Adam as if he's a real historical person. So, and my understanding too of that time in church history when there was a lot of allegorical interpretation, that wasn't at the expense of the historicity of it. So a lot of times when those church fathers would interpret things allegorically, they weren't denying that they happened historically. They were just sort of importing this meaning on top of it. So maybe talk about, very quickly before we go to the models, what is the kind of general approach of church history, the church fathers, did they see Adam as what we would now call the sole biological progenitor of the human race?
Yeah, so some of that is hard to track down because we're using now language in a modern scientific framework because we're dealing with a particular emergence of theistic evolution that didn't exist. So they didn't face that scientific challenge. So when you look at the progression of the church councils, for example, throughout history, well, until there's certain Irenaeus has his own heresies that come up, there's no dealing with is Jesus homoousis or all this technical language that develops over time. So there's a danger in trying to read back into these historical theologians, these early church writers and theologians, our current argument and trying to use them to solve our current problem. So I think part of the challenge I have with people trying to find, well, Augustine has my view and this person, Tertullian, has my view. I think part of that is a flawed assumption that I can read back our language and then reinterpret them with that. It's presentism, and it's a bad idea historically to treat it that way. I think the best we
Yeah,
can
that's good.
do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
yeah. I
good.
think the best we can do is say, look, they affirmed the historical Adam, and even though they're using it allegorically, think about like a person, a pastor who preaches on David, and then he says, "Oh, David, took the stones and he put the sling and he hit the giant." He says, "And we're like David, and you need to pick up your stones and you need to slay those giants in your life." But maybe they don't spend much time historically looking at David. They go right to the analogy of faith. They go right to this is what it matters to us. And sometimes that can lead to some really bad theology because you haven't embedded it in the historical time frame.
Yeah.
Well, I think this is what happens historically as well. You had in these early years people looking at these analogies, trying to take what does it really mean theologically through the lens of Christ, but they weren't as concerned with the historical reality. So they didn't deal with those historical realities in the way that would be helpful to us in unpacking theistic evolution. So I don't really find a huge necessity to say Augustine has my view or Tertullian protects my idea so much to know that this is that basic framework. They were historically affirming historicity and that it mattered, but theologically they were interpreting things to apply to their day in a way that I may not have think is theologically very helpful sometimes, but it's not going to solve our question of theistic evolution, animal to human origin,
Right. And that
evolutionary
goes both
origins.
ways too, I think, because it's like
Mhm.
theistic evolutionists shouldn't use that and we shouldn't because that's just not the
Yeah,
question they were asking, is essentially what you're saying there.
exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. That's my point. Yeah.
Yeah. Very good. Okay. Let's do the models. Talk about the different models.
Okay. So let me start with what I would call, I think, is the historic traditional biblical model. I don't mean to bias people with that language. If I want to use a more technical language, I'd say it's de novo monogenesis, which is a fancy way of saying de novo just means original, brand new, novel beginning, unique beginning. Mono means singular, Genesis means origin. So humanity, Adam and Eve, were not evolved from lower hominids. God didn't guide a process of biological change over time to create humanity. He created them as a unique kind, apart from all other kinds. And they were the first of many yet to come. Mono, one origin. So there aren't multiple human origins. Okay, that's our first model. And that is the beginning of all soulish humanity. So then we could look at probably the other model that came next, really, was the archetypal Adam. This is the one that you're kind of referring to earlier, where you have a population group of 10,000 people. And out of that, God selected two as the representative of humanity. But biologically, that population base of say 10,000 was indistinguishable from those two. God selected them for because of some agency they had, or maybe some consciousness, awareness, or whatever factor. People pick different reasons for it, but they were selected out of that group. And so the Adam that we read about is an archetype. He's a kind of all the humanity that evolved on the earth. And a lot of times we get that interpretation again, like David is an archetype or Abraham is an archetype. So people don't necessarily believe that they necessarily were historical. Even the historicity of David was doubted into the 90s until you get evidence. And so everything was an archetypal interpretation. It doesn't matter if he's real or not, as long as we understand his purpose for why he's there to tell a story. So that's our second one. The third one that really comes out that's significant today is Josh Swaminathan's model, which is I label as genealogical polygenesis. Swaminathan hates that I call it polygenesis. He insists he's a monogenesis, but he redefines those terms ahistorically because he doesn't like the implications of his view. So he gets mad at me for that. Don't care. So if folks want to read some stuff, I can lead them to that. But you can just search my site at morethancape.org, and I talk about his polygenic views. But he uses this word genealogical as a technical term that deals with population genetics, which is his expertise as a population geneticist. Now, what was significant about Josh Swamidass when he did this in 2017-18 is that he really showed how that other model of two people pulled from what could be no less than a group of 10,000 was failed. And we can talk about where that fails later, but just I'll stay focused on the models. And he said, what population genetics shows us is that we could all be descendants of Adam and Eve. By the time Paul says that we're all descendants, that could be true even if we evolved from a larger, from a larger population base. So he'll say that there was a garden created 10,000 years ago. Adam and Eve were created uniquely inside that garden. They did not evolve, but then they interbred with the other humans outside the garden. So he'll argue that it's the Genesis 1, 2, 3 is talking about a covenantal lineage, not a actual biological human lineage. Does that make sense? That's the one I'll
Yeah.
pause on before I do the last. I'll do Craig's next, but I just want to make sure that I'm trying to thumbnail sketch these as best as I can so we get the
Yeah.
big ideas, 30,000-foot view. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah. That's kind of like
Okay.
addressing adjacent to the question I was asking earlier,
Yeah. Yeah,
sort of.
exactly. These all cover over those ideas. So that's Swamidasa's. Now, Craig comes along and says, well, he doesn't believe that there's a recent origin because he doesn't like Swamidasa's model because he believes that Adam and Eve have to stand as what he'll use language like fountainhead of all humanity. He'll say sole progenitor of humanity, but not biological. So this is where
Because it's
because he
theological.
uses, yes, it's theological, but he uses Swamidasa's genealogical language in his model. So what he'll say is that humans evolved through some God-guided process, and he won't give any details because he wants it to be sort of a mere Christianity type approach. He wants it to be as broad and all-encompassing as possible so you can fill in the theological gaps any way you like. So he says, well, he traces it back to a group called Homo heidelbergensis. So we go back hundreds of thousands of years where this Adam and Eve evolved from within a group, but God selects them. So it's kind of like that model of selecting them within. But he'd say that even though there's some biological symmetry, he even argues that there might have been some God could have intervened and done something unique biologically with them, or it could just be their soulish existence was changed. So you could have biologically equivalent, but they would be non-humans, he would argue. They weren't human in the way Adam and Eve were human. So there's some mystical God working there, whether that be, again, through the soul or biology, that makes them distinct from the evolved hominid group that they come out of. And then he'll say that all humans, all soulish humans, descend from that original pair. The problem for Craig is, and this is where his language is just confused, and I've spent years trying to figure this out, and I've tried to write about it as well as best I can. Because he uses Swamidasa's science and genealogical language, Craig's model does allow for the interbreeding of some descendant of Adam and Eve with some biological analog, human, whatever that means, outside of that group. But he'll argue that it wouldn't be bestiality, but he argues that only soulish humans descend from them. So at this point, I think is where his model makes no sense, to be honest, because it breaks down the language. He's traded in multiple language sets and trying to make them reconcile when they're irreconcilable. And so that's why his model is, I think, the most confused of the models, because it's trying to pull together too much that it makes you have to redefine a lot of terms.
Yeah, I'm a simple person. I'm a simple girl. And it just seems like there's a lot of, not to just use an overused word, but theological gymnastics to try to cram this into what the scripture is actually teaching. I mean,
That's the
just
upshot.
seems like it's a lot more simple than it needs to be. And what it sounds like is that And again, I'm just asking questions because and I don't mean that in a Candace Owens kind of way. I mean, I'm literally asking
I
you this
just tried
question
you.
because I'm asking questions because I haven't read his book, or, you have, I haven't. So I am just
Yeah.
asking you these questions. But that's what
Hmm.
it seems like to me, is that it's like, okay, we have these scientific, maybe consensus conclusions that we're trying to cram into the biblical text and try to make that harmonize in some way, when that the natural reading of the text would not lead somebody to there. And that doesn't mean that necessarily that position is wrong, because of course the Bible isn't going to go, if evolution was the way God did it, book of Genesis isn't going to be like, okay, here's what a hominid is. It's like that would get way too
Yeah.
convoluted to communicate. So I'm not just like discounting it offhand, but it does seem that it is very confusing, and you'd have to almost like
Hmm.
really manipulate the language to make that work.
You do.
But so that
It's
brings me to the
absolutely true.
science question, though, because I think
Hmm.
ultimately what's at the bottom of this is people are trying to make sense of what do we do with the modern consensus of science, which I know that's changing on evolution anyway. But
Yeah.
maybe talk about that a little bit. Like, do you think that modern science has disproved the Genesis account to where we would have to then take a new look to just try to make this work now?
Yeah. So the short answer is no, it has not. So I'll be as clear on that as I can from the jump, because it gets more complex after that. But that's the big answer. And this is why I think these models of theistic evolution are so tragic, because they're coming at a time in history where there isn't this clarity on animal to human evolution specifically. We have clarity on the what people call the microevolution, right? That things change over time. There is a historical bear that could have been on Noah's Ark, and as it migrated to different parts, it becomes a black bear or a polar bear, and has enough genetic diversity that it could speciate and populate the earth. But that doesn't argue for the macro picture of animal to human evolution, which is the part that I believe is unnecessary to accommodate or to change our theology based on that. So it does win us applause in the popular sense or in the world, but theology still has to win. So no, it doesn't. And this goes back to what we were saying earlier. So in 2017, this is where this idea came to head scientifically. Scott McKnight, the New Testament scholar, partners with Dennis Venema, who was a guy at BioLogos, who had that view of the population base of 10,000 and God picks two among those. That was their view. The book was called Adam and the Genome, and the subtitles Reading Scripture After Genetic Science. So they give away the game, and this is what a lot of these views do. I argue it's what Craig and Swamidas and McKnight all are doing in their different models. Uh, all of these models are essentially prioritizing science and a consensus science that is changing, and then using that to reinterpret the text. But the problem was the failed because Swamidas ended up leaving BioLogos and saying that doesn't make sense with population genetics. So Ann Gager at Discovery Institute also has done some really good research in this, showed why that doesn't work. So I'd point you to her work as well. Ann's a great gal, and she's retired from Discovery Institute. I think she's still doing the research on this as well. So that showed that no, you don't have to have these big population bases. So where did that leave Adam and Eve? Well, it becomes scientific plausible. We're not going to prove it. This is what we have to understand, that science isn't about proving these ancient historical events. That's not what science does. Science, these models are all they're telling a story. Scientists tell story, and they're using a set of assumptions. Some are scientific assumptions about mutation rates, original genetic diversity within these population bases, or founding pair population bases. And then the scientists use these set of assumptions. They build a model. They select the facts that work with these set of assumptions, and then based on their worldview, they present an answer to these. And this is what we've seen why these models have all fallen and have become questioned and doubtful, because we just think, well, the science says, or the
Hmm.
science tells us. But that's not true. That's not good science. That's worldview framing that doesn't allow for competing ideas. So again, if we look at that view of science, our philosophy of science, Adam and Eve, as the sole biological progenitors of all humankind, is plausible based on a lot of new genetic findings, or at least, again, models that take a different set of assumptions. Things like mitochondrial, you know, data and Y chromosome lineage. We can define those in a second, but we trace these back and we can see just how much genetic diversity would be required to produce a diverse population of, say, Black people and white people and Asian people and whatever our ethnic and racial, I don't like that word racial, but the way we interpret it, at least way we interpret that, you could have that explained if Adam and Eve have enough genetic diversity built into them by God from the beginning,
Hmm.
assuming, again, no recessive genes, no genetic flaws, because they're without sin. So this also explains that their kids could produce other kids. There is no problem with Adam's son and daughter making babies, because there aren't genetic deformities introduced into the population base until much later on. So you can have this make sense scientifically as probable once we understand what the bad assumptions are made based on naturalistic worldview commitments.
Right. And I think you bring up a good point about the scientific consensus. You can't just try to make scripture fit the current scientific consensus, because throughout
Mm-hmm.
history, the scientific consensus has been wrong. Like decades ago, it was the multi regional hypothesis that, scientists thought that humans kind of sprung up from all over the different parts of the world. And then that,
Which
that's,
is actually coming back, by the way.
oh, is it coming back? Is it?
There are people that are arguing that again. Yeah.
Okay, well, that was accepted and then rejected, and then,
Yeah.
you have the the mitochondrial Eve and the Y chromosomal Adam. Maybe let's talk about that,
Mm-hmm.
because I was really fascinated when I first learned about some of this research that can actually trace this mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosomal Adam. What do we mean when we're talking about? I'll let you define those terms.
Okay. So my disclaimer on this, and I always find this, I am a theologian, a biblical theology. I study enough philosophy to be dangerous and enough science to be probably more dangerous. And I have studied with folks at Discovery Institute and through Reasons to Believe. And I think those folks have done the more technical work. My job is to say, okay, as a theologian, how do I take this science and understand it? So I'm going to define it within those parameters. So just so people know, that's my framework. So here's what I would say. If we look at our concept of, say, last genetic common ancestor, not necessarily Adam and Eve, but our last genetic bottleneck is another term people can look at. What is our bottleneck? Such as Noah's family, for example. Right? If we have Noah's family, if we're tracing back to them, which would make sense theologically, because all of us are also descendants of Noah in some way, then we realize that we're not really using this genetic science to trace back to an Adam and Eve. That's not what Christians are. That's not what we should argue. Many have, unfortunately, tried to make that argument. But that's not what the data is ever going to tell us. So mitochondrial Eve, in that sense, is taking, mDNA. That's how it's abbreviated sometimes, which is a pretty new thing. There's Pulitzer Prize one on this mRNA, mDNA kind of concept. So we're really discovering some of this. So just people know this is a very fluid thing in many ways. But mitochondrial Eve just means, and it's misleading because it doesn't actually point to Eve is the whole point. It's
Mhm.
used by, even in the secular literature, to point back to this single female who we could all trace a lineage back to. But that's just the most recent one from whom all living humans inherit some part of their mDNA. The Y chromosomal Adam is the most recent man from whom all living men would inherit their Y chromosome. Now, why that's important is because it wouldn't even necessarily mean that they're the same couple. Like we could trace back to our mDNA to a woman who's our last, but it could be different from the man who's the last one because it's only telling us what we could trace it back to, not
Hmm.
what's historically true about where they sit in the scope of human history. So that's kind of the thumbnail sketch of we've got to be careful when we're looking at this. And this does get into some population issues of what does that prove about single origins and that, but that's the basic definitions of what they mean. Is that I'll pause there and make
Yeah.
sure that you have
Yeah,
lost
no,
everybody.
that's very helpful because you mentioned the bottleneck, and if anybody's kind of unfamiliar with what you're talking about times throughout history, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong on this,
Mhm.
times throughout history when the human race was narrowed down to a very small group before
Yes.
expanding out again. So you have like Adam and Eve, then they have a bunch of kids and then populates a good portion of the earth, then the flood happens, and then we're back down to just Noah's family, that
Yes.
small group of people. So if you could just trace it back to that, you don't even actually have to go back to Adam and
Yeah.
Eve because you're essentially
Mhm.
that's the bottleneck that you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. Think about like a series of hourglasses. You start with all the sand in the top and it narrows down and then it expands out again. But think of human biological ancestry like a series of those. Because when we talk about bottleneck, there's really multiple potentially because you have isolated genetic populations. So for example, if people migrate and then they're on an island and then they lose capacity to get off that island, there could be a genetic bottleneck within the people on that island. You could have people all throughout history going different places and then they become genetically isolated, so you have smaller populations producing different genetically distinct groups of ethnos, of ethnicities and people groups that are geographically bounded. So when we're looking at the science of this, yes, the real question is, could the science allow for a bottleneck of two anywhere in human history? And even then, that wouldn't necessarily prove Adam and Eve were the first two because science isn't really built for that thing. It could just prove, is it possible? And I would argue probably we'll never be able to prove that because I don't think you could have a bottleneck of two anywhere in history except for the beginning of Adam and Eve, because I don't think you could have, because once you start to have recessive genes take place and you have genetic deformities come into mutations come in that are deleterious or destructive to whatever traits get passed on, you're going to have less genetic diversity than you would have in the original founding pair.
Right.
So I don't think we'll ever be able to prove that, but I do think we could look at enough evidence that says under the right conditions, it is possible and it is believable scientifically that could have happened. But that is as close as we'll get.
Yeah, that's good. And so would you say, I mean, just to put it very simply,
Mhm.
obviously you've said science has not disproved this, but would you even
Yeah.
go so far as to say that the direction of our understanding of certain scientific data could lead us toward it even more, not so much even
Yeah.
disproving, but actually is it moving in that direction, do you think?
It definitely, I think it definitely opens the door to believing that it is not unreasonable to believe in historic Adam and Eve as sole biological progenitors of all humanity. I think the science opens the door to that. Just like Christians have used different arguments like the teleological argument, arguments from design, arguments from, the shape and structure of the universe, they prove this uncaused cause at the beginning, right? They don't prove the God of the Bible, but they prove that God is reasonable. Let's put it that way. It's
Yeah.
not unreasonable to believe in a God. I believe that science has pointed to that same kind of thing. It's not unreasonable to believe that Genesis tells us a true history of human origins as Adam and Eve created by the hand of God as the first two, again, biological progenitors of all humanity. And that is not checking your brain at the door.
Yeah, very good. Okay. Anything that we haven't covered that you're like, oh, we got to make sure we touch that point, or any kind of closing
Yeah.
remarks you might have on all of this?
Yeah. One last fine point on that about the origins within a population base, because I do think that that's something that I think there's a word game that gets played with people, sort of
Okay.
like our literal or historical right? That Adam and Eve, or that they were from an early population base of humans or hominids, however people want to put it. So is that possible? Do these models allow for Adam and Eve coming from within a larger population base? And I would say the answer is yes, it does allow for that, but there's a qualification. This again doesn't mean that Adam and Eve weren't the first two people who were the founding pair behind that population base. In other words, were Adam and Eve chosen out of a population base, or were Adam and Eve the founders of that, the originators of that population base? See, because again, that's where the science is going to tell us, okay, there's a genetic group of 5,000 or 2,000 or 7,000, whatever it is, that's necessary for our modern genetic diversity. That still doesn't preclude the possibility of two people being the founding pair behind that genetic population base. All it tells us is this is what the science, how far back science can go. So I don't think Christians should be afraid of that language because it doesn't undermine what we've been talking about. So does that point make sense? Where
Yeah,
I
that's
want
good.
people to not be intimidated by that.
Right, that's good. And then as we close out, we mentioned your study guide in the opening, but go on and with your own words, tell us about the study guide and where people can find that and where they can connect with you.
Yeah. So years ago, I published a book called Set Apart. It's published by Reasons to Believe. The fun part about that book is I wrote that as my Master of Arts in Science and Master of Arts in Science and Religion that I got from a Young Earth seminary. And it was published through an Old Earth group.
Mhm.
And the whole point of that is showing the uniqueness of Genesis, why it was written, how it was written. Now, that book itself has a lot of technical language that I was trying to bridge the technical literature to this important idea of what sets Genesis apart. The study guide I just published, actually just went live a couple of weeks ago, is trying to simplify that language so that if somebody wanted to do a study group on Genesis and why it's unique, the elements of making it distinct from other ancient mythologies and polytheistic religions and uniqueness of de novo creation, all that kind of language. And it simplifies the language at a study group level so that if a leader wants to get the book and read that and then guide a group through that, they'd have a language set to make it a little more simple. And that's what the study guide was really meant for, to help make that next step from the academic to the basic argument, and then from the academic to a group study level for Genesis.
Very
And then
good.
get
All
that
right.
at morethancake.org at my site. You can find it.
Morethancake.org. All right.
Yeah.
Anything else you're working on you want to let people know about?
Oh man, I'm working on a new series. I'm pretty excited about. People might get mad at me for this. I know certain people have, but I'm actually developing an 8-part series on incarnational apologetics. It's all related to a lot of my worldview stuff because I have about 30 videos on worldview that I teach for my students. But I'm using some AI technology to generate a dialogue.
Is that why
And
people
I
are mad at you?
hopefully, yeah,
Because of
some
AI?
people
Yeah.
get mad at me because of AI usage, but they're
Yeah.
just generating the dialogue. All the content is mine. It's just I'm using them for the voices to create sort of an approach that I hopefully will appeal to younger people to get them back reading books because they don't like to read. So that's
Yeah.
my ultimate goal. So I have that project going on. That's pretty fun. I'm excited about that. I'll probably start unrolling that in a couple, maybe a month or so. It should be pretty exciting. Its own little podcast channel called Apologetics Dialogues.
All right. Well, I want to thank my guest, Dr. Joe Miller, and we will link to all the things we talked about in the show notes so you can check all that stuff out for yourself. And let's just remember, as we pursue Christ, to keep a sharp mind, a soft heart, and a thick skin. We'll see you next time.